Welcome to the America's Future series.
Thank you for having me. How's it going today?
Going good today. So a lot of conversations, and some of them that directly relate to your area of expertise and your interest. Paul has his own space institute. I want him to tell us a little bit about that. But I also want to first thank him. He's let his broad base of followers, subscribers to his newsletter, et cetera, know about this. And so for all of your friends and all of your colleagues, Paul, I want to thank you for inviting us and helping spread the word. So Paul, if you would, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about the Space Institute. Space Strategies
Okay,
Institute.
well, I'm with the Space Strategy Center, and it's almost 49 years now. I've been doing outer space policy planning for essentially space warfare. And I'm retired now, semi-retired, and I've got several books coming out in the next few months on the subject, particularly one that's called The Battle Beyond: Fighting and Winning the Coming War in Space. And it's actually detailed discussion of all the doctrine, strategies, and tactics one would implement in order to win a space war. So I've been working that. I've got a space warfare unclassified discussion group with close to 22,000 members. I mean, I've got several hundred from the White House and over 2,000 general officers and admirals and so forth. So it's, it's an interesting group of people to discuss sort of, the overall policy and how one conducts himself in a strategic way for space wars.
Well, I would encourage people to check out the Space Strategy Center. Could you tell them what your website is there?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. And if you join with me on LinkedIn, then you automatically would be part of that. Now, you could also send me a direct email at paul.symanski, SZYMANSKI, at satellitewar.com. And I could put you on via that way.
Well, that would be great. So, Paul, you may have heard some of these conversations, I think, during the day about the threats that we face from nation states and other actors, et cetera. If you could, just tell us a little bit what you think is the most important threat we face, and maybe if you were king for a day, if you were in charge of space strategies, space policy for the United States, where you think we should focus our efforts, where we need to focus our investment, and what we need to be most careful about.
Okay, now I want to emphasize, if you're talking ancient Greek hoplite warfare or futuristic space warfare, it's still between human minds. It's still between adversary commanders trying to force their will on each other, and their doctrine, their education, their experience, their fears, their culture, and all of that plays one way or the other. And I think in some sense, there's too much of an emphasis on, oh, look at these cool weapon systems and all. And there's so many instances in military history where somebody who is supposedly stronger on paper, Maginot Line kind of mentality, was defeated by theoretically inferior forces. So it's still so much of the human element. Now, some of the other issues are space is global by definition. So you can't just sit there and think tactically that, oh, I've got this satellite I need to defend, and maybe I'm going to attack this other space system. There has strategic consequences, worldwide consequences, and political consequences after the war. I mean, I've come to realize that you're not really fighting the war, you're fighting the peace. The whole point of the war is geopolitical realignments afterwards. And so you've got to be very careful of what you're doing in space and what the consequences are. So, for example, you might gleefully say, oh, boy, look at all these great weapon systems I have, and I destroyed this and I destroyed that. Haha, I won. Well, maybe you created so much debris that all your allies are really mad at you afterwards. Or maybe you lost that space war and your allies start kind of shrinking away from you and going to your adversary saying, I guess the US wasn't as strong as I thought it was. And these are the things you've got to keep thinking. So one thing is we're kind of used to terrestrial conflicts, but we're not used to space wars and how it might really come down. And I believe it's highly political. I mean, people are used to things being blown up on the ground, but not things being destroyed in space. So you have to consider those political aspects. And then also, there's a certain problem and a certain benefit of space is it's largely hidden from view. You're talking tens of thousands of kilometers away. It's very difficult to directly image a satellite. Anti-satellite weapon systems don't have big red stars painted on the side. It's very hard to figure out what's coming off. Now, that's kind of good in that you can show intent, resolve, will on your adversary by doing secretive things in space, and this has happened in the past, without the general public getting all upset and forcing you to, war on the ground. And so it's hidden from public view, but it's actually largely hidden from other parts of your government. If the Space Force is doing something funny up there, they're not necessarily going to tell the Navy or the Army or whatever. And so it's the typical contest between the different military services and things like that. The other thing too is one might sit there and say, oh, well, everything's visible in space. Well, if you look at, I think almost half of the current space catalog is listed as analyst objects, meaning they don't really know who owns them and what they do, or if they're just a piece of junk. So really half the things up there, you don't know what's coming off. And it's actually very easy to hide things in space. I have a whole briefing on how to do that. And then the other thing too is, the other kind of general rule is you only get to fight with what's in that part of space that you have there. It takes days and weeks to maneuver assets around. And let's say you're in some conflict in the Western Pacific, and you might have NATO allies in Europe saying, oh, look at these great systems, we can move to help you. Well, my calculations have shown space wars are over with in 24 to 48 hours. You got to fight with what you got there at that time in one way or the other. And the other thing is the physics are a little bit different. And again, people keep thinking of tactical, but how do you define closeness of two objects in space? And I define it as the amount of delta V fuel it would take to get you in the amount of time. So there could be an object, a threatening object, on the opposite side of the Earth. But if it's in the same altitude and inclination, it doesn't take too much fuel or time to do phasing burns to come at you, So you have to really consider a different way of looking at space, situation maps and things like that. So getting to that, what are the basic principles of how to fight and win space wars? So I'll go over how to win, and then I'll go over how to lose. How to win a space war, situational awareness is everything. Space situational awareness, space domain awareness, whatever you want to call it. And that's true on the ground too, but even more so in space because everything's so much obscure. I already mentioned the pre-conflict positioning. Are you going to fight a war in Europe? Are you going to fight a war in the West Pacific? Maybe that means different space assets, deploying years ahead of time. Do you have decisive political will? And that is, if a war is over with in 24 hours and you're not even sure who's attacking you. I mean, you could think of, well, we're at war over Taiwan and the Western Pacific, and suddenly some of our satellites start blinking out. And you might just make the assumption, well, it must be China doing it. Well, maybe it's Russia trying to stir the pot. How do you know? You're going to start a space war when you're not really sure. And so you can essentially self-deter to the point where, oh, it's over with, you lost, and then the other thing is in some sense, you can lose on the ground. You could fight in space, and there's examples like this, and think you won, but then you lost on the ground. And the other thing too is both sides can claim they won the space war. Oh, I took out all of your imagery satellites. No, I took out all your communication satellites. Well, what's better? That's kind of hard to do since space is mostly information, generating it and transmitting it. So it's information war. And so how do you understand that. So there's all these different things that you can mess up with. For example, how you lose a space war is uncertainty and confusion, self-deterrence I mentioned. You're in the wrong positions. You're fighting the wrong kind of war. Oh, I opted for lasers versus jammers, cyber weapons, these rendezvous and proximity operations, close approach things, some with manipulator arms, is all these things that you could kind of do wrong beforehand. You could win the war, and I mentioned, lose the peace, the political impacts. So there's all these issues I don't believe are being discussed at Space Force. That, I've talked to lieutenants up to general officers, this concept that everything you do there is strategic and everything you do there is political. And so that's the thing. Now, if you want to get down to technical, and what I feel after 49 years in the business is the biggest threat, that's something that just came out a month or two ago, called FOBS, Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. It's something that the Russians had in the 60s and 70s, and we developed nuclear direct ascent and anti-satellites like on Johnston Island to counter those. But according to this article, news article on C.L.A.S.S, China is developing these orbital bombardment systems. So to my mind, that is the biggest threat in space, bombardment of our cities from space. Now, I did a study on this in the 80s that went up to the National Security Council. And we were, like everyone else, discussing Warsaw Pact and, how do we counter that in Europe. And one thing we came up with was delivering smart munitions, not nuclear, from reentry vehicles. And we went and talked to reentry vehicle manufacturers and say, well, yeah, that's technically possible. We could fill it full of these multiple munitions that take out tanks and deliver it to the same conditions from space, to the same conditions an A-10 aircraft would deliver them. And I did the operations research study on that and found out they were very effective in defeating armor 40 years ago, And so if people thought this stuff through, plus, if I remember correctly, I think a pound of lead going 12,000 feet per second is equivalent to a pound of TNT. So if you just had 2 tons of concrete up in space and laid it down on the city, you've got, at hypervelocities, you've got 2 tons of TNT and stuff like that. So it's something one has to look at, understand. I'm not sure how to defend, if they're capable of doing that. And maybe ultimately that's what a space war is all about, is taking out the adversary's ability to bombard our cities.
Yeah. And being able, you have to be able to see what they're doing first to know what they're doing, right?
That's right. And intent. Oh, we've got it up there now. Do they really intend to do it now? Should we just blow it up because we don't like it? Or because tension on the ground? Or are we going to start a space war because we push the button too fast? Intent is everything, and that's very human. That's hard to say.
Well, some of our near peers, China in particular, have demonstrated the capability of knocking their own satellites out in order to get rid of debris or whatever. Well, that probably wasn't the intent, right? The intent was to be able to show that we could knock things out of the air if we want to, out of space. And then there's we talk about going out into an asteroid and mining it for the value greater than our world economy, right? And but if we can do that, we can also go get the debris, the chunk of concrete that you're talking about, and flinging it down at our air. We can take asteroids and throw them at our opponents, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
And science fiction writers write about that sort of thing all the time, right?
But it's technically possible. And then going back to, I think you were referring to the Chinese pulled out one of their Badao navigation satellites that supposedly was dead, and pulled it out to graveyard orbit. At least that's what the press said. They had a manipulator satellite with the arms and pulled it and said, oh, we're just taking it away, it's dead, we don't want it to hurt anything. And I'm more of a suspicious nature, and it just seemed to me, graveyard orbit is 300 kilometers plus or minus geosynchronous. They brought it up to 3,000 kilometers, which takes a lot more fuel. It sounds like they were getting rid of the evidence. just before 2 days after the US launched two new inspection satellites, again in the press and so forth. So there's this whole cat and mouse game, I think, going on in space, much like the 60s, 70s, 80s, I guess. Russian destroyers cutting off American destroyers, sometimes maybe accidentally hitting them, maybe it wasn't accidental. I think this whole thing is, going on in space,
Well,
in
I
one way or the other.
appreciate you bringing that up, because the closest analogous model, and there are none really, like you say, we're always going from hoplite to fast of light, speed of light. It's hard to compare, eras of warfare, but the closest domain seems to be a lot like the old naval battles, because 100 years ago we couldn't find ships very easily. We didn't, the distances were so vast, et cetera, right? And the rules of the road and maritime law and all this kind of stuff, it's uncharted territory to a certain extent. And if I was to pick a domain that was somewhat similar, I think space is a lot like naval warfare, is a closest analogy. Would you say that, with only about 30 seconds left?
Yeah, that's a good cut. I mean, even old Star Trek series, they're called ships up there in space. They
The
had kind of
Academy.
a whole naval. Matter of fact, I think they were called admirals and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So you could be right on that, though. There's some similarities for airplanes, and I've taken a lot of classical airplane doctrine, and it fits very well. Air defense doctrine and all, it fits very well into the space environment.
Well, I want to thank you for your time again. Thank you for the work that you do, doing all the what if scenarios, doing the research, and bringing these things up to those people who are responsible for our protection. So I want to thank you for the work of the Space Strategy Center, and thank you for being with us today, Paul. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you for giving me the time.
Absolutely.
Have a good day.